Dr. Castleberry here with our COM 4413, Common Cultural Change video lecture, our asynchronous dialogue in progress. We were fielding some questions from Destiny, and now we're going to pivot and look at some questions from John in reference to Mattel's television and American culture. First up, John writes, how much impacted the black and white format of The Twilight Zone, a feature not only in some of our readings this week, plural, but also our recommended screening, plural, for week one as well. So how much impact did the black and white format of The Twilight Zone have on its viewers? Is the television show still known for its format? And so I think something we can note right off the bat is black and white would have very much been a normative experience for audiences still. There was that kind of transitional point in television history where you could easily view some programs in color, just as many were still being produced and broadcast in black and white. So I think it would have been much more accepted then, and certainly when we go back and view it now, it has a vintage feel and hopefully flair to it, if based on your screening experience. And one of the things maybe black and white production allowed for, kind of like low definition as opposed to high definition programming, was the sets, the set design, those kinds of things could be manufactured and to be presentable as much more accepted and realistic, versus how they might look in full color or full resolution, okay? And so that gets at another aspect of thinking about television, which is production design. And recognizing early television was produced on the cheap, in culturally relevant terms, in economic terms rather, I should say, not culturally relevant terms, but in economic terms, somewhat cheaper to produce programming that you were able to pull off more with less. In terms of is it still known for, is the television show still known for its format? Well, the format of the Twilight Zone was that it was first of all, it was dramatic television, but it's what we call an anthology series, meaning it was each episode you could anticipate you're getting a brand new type of story or narrative. Okay, so these standalone episodes that would be just collected into seasons and what have you, and that anthology format definitely had a tapering off period. Okay, so it lowered in popularity with audiences, with TV consumers, and even as recently as checking out the Twilight Zone chapter of How to Watch TV that we included, we kind of piecemealed from Ethan Thompson as well as Mattel, right, co-editors of this book. We looked at Derek Compere's essay on the Twilight Zone. And there's a couple of instances based on when this was written where even this author comments on the fixed nature of the anthology versus today, and that assertion is already outdated by some of our recent contemporary trends in television production. However, in terms of its legacy, Compere writes, 50 years later, The Twilight Zone's legacy appears not so much in contemporary programs, but rather in the unabated circulation of the original episodes, and in the even wider spread of its most celebrated moments and of the figure of Serling himself. Okay, but still the series can be found in the aspirations of would-be television iconoclasts, for whom The Twilight Zone and Serling function as key models of attitude, if not norm. So we're referring to, Rod Serling is recognized by TV scholars as very much one of the forefathers of this movement toward another new term perhaps for some of us, auteur TV, right? So borrowing from film theory, borrowing from that sort of film criticism language, this idea of the auteur, the singular voiced showrunner, creator of a series that has a lot of creative control over the content. Serling was of this mold, and would push against the standards of the time to create memorable, lasting, and challenging, culturally challenging narratives that force the audience to think, but also disguised it, right, through the format of the bizarre, of like the horrific, of the mystery, the suspense, and so on. Because this was a way in which audiences needed to take it in order to perhaps give it room to breathe. There was a brief, excellent couple of lines in here that I was going to go back over, and now they've disappeared from the mindscape. But in addition to Mattel and Thompson and Compere's essay work, we did get, there is an additional writing coming out of TV the Book, Sepinwall and Seitz work. And they talk about the Twilight Zone, and they recognize a little bit about the role of not only the series, but the showrunner, or that auteur in Serling himself. But Serling wanted to write more pointedly about politics and social issues, much to his employer's chagrin. Hey, fun facto, distributed by CBS. We were just talking about CBS earlier. And he went to great lengths to do so. The format disguised is, I think, the aspect that's so iconic about Twilight Zone, makes it so worthy of assessing even today. The format disguised social commentary so pointed that if the series had been conceived in a more straightforward way, Serling's scripts never would have seen the light of day. Thus, the best Zone episodes are simultaneously of their time and timeless. Excellent reading of the impact of Twilight Zone, and we have seen the rebirth and revival of the anthology series and contemporary programming. Notably, perhaps the most prominent example would be FX's American Horror Story, where each season is a standalone story arc in its own right. But FX is starting to broaden, even franchise the anthology with other series like American Crime Story, where they emphasized, they spent the whole season looking at the O.J. Simpson case, and then the upcoming season where they're looking at the assassination of Gianni Versace, and so the anthology is getting some cultural play again now, right? People have warmed back up to it. In fact, HBO's True Detective was approached as an anthology series, but the first season was so well received, so well acted, directed, and written, arguably, that they struggled to sustain that anthology format. So it was starting to burn out by the second season, and they had to go on a long hiatus, possibly, ended, until they recently are going to revive it for what's possibly a third and final season. Okay, so the anthology series, alive and well in American TV today, and we can thank the Twilight Zone for that. So good questions there, John. Did the episodes of Twilight Zone help viewers cope with the world events that were taking place during that era, 59 to 63, when the show ran? If so, how? Well, like any argument one would make about TV as a cultural institution, you can never make the whole case or the whole argument about what television can do for an audience. Okay, because it's already a simulated series of signs and symbols. Any given television program, it has what Stuart Hall will call the ability to be decoded through multiple lenses of interpretation. All right, and so you can't guarantee a given show will have an impact on everyone in the same way. A lot of people can feel very collectively moved by certain texts, but it's not a guarantee. All right, and so that's some slippery terrain, but we can have fun slipping around with that. The first question Mattel asked is, what is television? Of course, why wouldn't that be the first question? It sparks our interest in his book, Television and American Culture. How has television impacted our lives in ways that differ from the definitions provided by the author later on page 2? Okay, and so rather than listing all of those, you can look at, they're bullet pointed on page 2. I've come up with some additional categories that I feel like speak to what John's asking here. Ways television, or areas in which television impacts our lives. You can think about the impact on an economic level. So economically, of course, culturally, right? The way it shapes culture, it co-creates culture, it reflects culture. It reports on culture. Internationally, right? Television, it has an international impact now, especially with the rise of streaming services, Netflix, HBO Go, or Now, or whatever. All of these efforts to become international brands, right, on a global scale. This sparks change. This is a way in which television has highly persuasive power. An argument can be made, right? Television helps kind of secularize culture, right? In a way that if there were certain cultural norms that a lot of people abided by 100 years ago versus 75 years ago versus 50 years ago, we can see some of those tides change over time in the way in which television sort of updates and frames the world, frames the way we think and act. So it has that broad social power to it, as well as now the internet and social media specifically has sort of taken over that role. Spatial arrangements, geographic arrangements. So I've talked before about this, how the dynamics of the living room in the average American household changed. They were altered by the mass acquisition of television sets in the home. And this is something tons of scholars have written about. There's a few books on that sort of thing. Ian Ang has an excellent book, Desperately Seeking Audiences, as well as, oh no, where'd it go? I will find it and put it on display for you all. But there's another, gosh, where is it? Another book, highly recommend, and don't want to discount that scholar, but don't want to discredit them either. So, and so maybe even when we're talking about spatial changes, maybe even the fragmentation of families itself. I think an interesting question we could always pose is how many people grew up with a single television in the home in the center area versus there was a point in time in which a whole generation or two were starting to get TVs in their own rooms. And so all of a sudden you hear stories about everything from, well, you go to your separate room in the evening to people outright eating supper, right, dinner in separate rooms, that sort of thing. So it's a reality that many faced, and you can't discount the impact that could have on a number of categories. Okay, so let's see. Has today's technology made former production processes obsolete? If so, how? Many production methods and practices still take place, I think we can say, in television production. However, digital technologies, have changed the requirements, the pace, the consumer mindset, and the critical expectations of television. So we do see those. And I've talked earlier about single camera to multi-camera experience, and so we continue to see these things. Tech shifts, high definition, DVR, time shifting, streaming, 4K now. So we have all these different devices that will continue to bend the way we do things, and they will speed some things up and make other things more obsolete. All right, so great questions here, and we've got just a few more we're going to squeeze in part 3 of our video lecture series.